I'd like to give a content warning before I start this episode. The film I'm going to discuss today will involve me having to bring up things such as sexual violence, homophobia, misogyny, stalking, animal cruelty, and ableism, which is a lot more of a content warning than I usually give. But if for any reason you feel as though you won't be able to sit through discussions involving those themes, then I won't blame you if you skip this episode. Hello, my name is Amber, and this is You Look Like a Badger, a podcast where I discuss queer cinema. So this season of the show is one where I discuss the lowest rated LGBT films, specifically because I need to punish myself. In all seriousness, I think this season of the show is giving me an opportunity to provide critical analysis of movies that have maybe been dismissed as bad and therefore have not been given the depth that they, well, not deserve, but kind of require to understand why they exist, how they exist, and what their function in culture has been. Today's movie is a film that I watched when I was a teenager, and the only thing that I really remembered about it was one specific scene involving a kitten. And I remember it being a lot more disturbing than it actually ended up being. Today's movie is The Roommate.
I can't believe she ran out on you. Thank you for coming. Of course. I was up. What are you having? Pancakes. That's what I was thinking. You know, tonight Tracy had her shot. Tomorrow you're all mine. I want to show you the big city the right way, and I promise I won't abandon you.
The Roommate is a 2011 horror thriller directed by Christian E. Christensen, written by Sunny Malley, and starring Leighton Meester and Minka Kelly. Proudly a single white female ripoff, it follows the tumultuous relationship between Sarah, a fashion student starting college, and Rebecca, her roommate, who progressively reveals more sinister parts of herself the longer they share a living space. It's a film that proudly trots out homophobic tropes about predatory, yet ambiguously queer women, and the harm they can do to perfect, naive straight women who don't have their wits about them. One of the lesser problematic faves of mine, not quite living up to the more violent and sultry versions of this story, leaving less of an impact than it probably intended to have, especially with a built-in audience from its two main stars. In terms of awards, it didn't win any awards, but was nominated for several MTV Movie and Teen Choice Awards, and these were mainly for the cast, and I think mostly for Leighton Meester, which is understandable. It has a critical score on Rotten Tomatoes of 3%, which is astonishing, and an audience score of 27%, and it has a 2.2 on Letterboxd. Now, I can't say any of these are that surprising, really, because I knew that the films I'm doing this season have been quite reviled, and so far I mostly understand why. And whilst I have an affinity for women who are crazy, and there are definitely scenes in this movie that I enjoyed, I kind of understand and pretty much agree with every kind of criticism that has been leveled against this movie. But before we get into that, I'm going to read a couple of reviews from Letterboxd. This first one is by user H, who says, "I still don't get if she was gay or just crazy." And the thing about that is that is kind of the point. What you do with these kind of depictions, and you'll know if you watch several of these kinds of movies in a row, is that the queerness is encoded within mental illness, because homosexuality was considered a mental illness, and that kind of seeps down through culture. And the ambiguity of it, of not knowing whether she's gay or crazy, gives the filmmakers plausible deniability from being called homophobic when they do stuff like that. The second review is from Magnus Hoholt, who said that fedora was a bold move, and in more ways than one, this is an extremely 2011 movie, but especially the fashion. Having a character just wear a fedora, you know, like pre the stigma against them. It's kind of astonishing to see. It does border on camp, I'd say. And this last review is from Kowalski, who said, the two main girls look so similar that honestly I couldn't tell who I was looking at some scenes. And, you know, once again, also the point, you will find in these kinds of movies, they tend to cast women who look similar to one another. I do think there is also this kind of, I think especially in the early 2010s, though I don't believe it's gone away, the waifish, brown-eyed, brown-haired white woman who is like conventionally attractive was kind of just like a staple of movies and TV, you know, especially the TV shows that Leighton Meester and Minka Kelly were on, Gossip Girl and Friday Night Lights respectively. It's very much like it's not hard to find two hot women who look kind of similar, because that's kind of just how Hollywood cast people. But at the same time, it does work thematically. They're meant to be mirrors of one another, with one of them being the more normal one and the other one nearly lighting a man on fire, you know, as you do. I'll get into like that later on, how the main character Sarah's repressed anger manifests itself in Rebecca, but how it kind of doesn't quite line up, specifically because of how the movie is structured, and how like other examples of these kinds of movies just work a lot better because the two women at the center feel more connected. Whereas here, because it is so blatantly a rip-off and therefore doesn't feel as though it has to try as hard to convince you of this fact, it doesn't quite stick the landing. But before we get into that, before we go on this problematic with like a trademark at the end of that word, ride, what we're going to do is, what I'm going to do even, is I'm going to give a spoiler warning. If you haven't seen this movie, you should watch it. It's a fun enough time. It's like 90 minutes. It's worth it for the Leighton Meester scenes. You can kind of skip everything else. But I do think that like once you watch it, you will kind of see other better movies within it. I'm gonna ruin it from here on out. So if you haven't seen it, go watch it and then come back, listen to the rest of this episode.
Hey, Sarah. Listen, something is up with your roommate.
What do you mean?
She was outside my room this morning.
Doing what?
Waiting for me? I opened my door and there she was, just sitting there staring like some psycho.
Why would she do that?
You ask her. I'm staying away from her.
As with a lot of media that is employing homophobic tropes, like the most obvious way to employ them is to just present someone who expresses same-sex desire in any way as someone who is strange, unhinged, crazy, or violent and evil. It's not a new thing, really. It does feel weird strictly blaming this movie for employing it. It's one in a history of doing it. It does bring forward tropes about lesbian and bisexual women to a new generation of people who wouldn't have had to live through that kind of stuff in the 80s and 90s, when these kind of movies were like more prevalent, when homophobia felt more at the surface. In a lot of ways, I think a lot of the backlash towards this movie is simply this regression, and I think it turns up a lot in late 2000s, early 2010s horrors, where they will try to get away with as much button-pushing stuff as they can. So I've talked about lesbian vampire killers in a similar kind of way. There's this desire to like provoke in a way that is like nihilistic and in their minds transgressive, because they're kind of tropes that have been buried for a long time, and if you bring them back up they feel new and fresh because you're presenting them to a new audience, even though they're some of the oldest stuff in the books. There's this like compulsion to pathologize Rebecca, create like the briefest of tragic origin stories, and then encode her behavior with obsession and queerness. So it is very literally queer as in strange, queer as in weird, the OG definition of the word. We learn that Rebecca has been somewhat emotionally neglected by her parents. She says stuff like love in her house looked like being sent to Beverly Hills with a platinum card, and that nothing was free in her house, and that the relationship she has with her parents is very transactional. The way that they've kind of coped with their daughter's emotional problems is by simply medicating her and then sending her far away. So when she says stuff like, it was never a home when I lived here, we get the idea that she is not someone who has had the opportunity to be an emotionally mature person because she's been neglected and kind of sequestered into this mindset that she can buy whatever she wants and she can get people to do whatever she wants because that is how she's been taught to live. And so it is an affront to her when Sarah does not reciprocate her emotions back to her. Granted, I'm doing a lot of reading that I don't feel like is encouraged when you're watching the film for the first time. The way that Rebecca is written and the way that Leighton Meester plays Rebecca is not a character that is particularly complex. It is only when I rewatched the movie and I caught these dialogue parts that feel like they're almost whispered to the audience that I kind of imbued this character with complexity. And I like doing a deep reading. I like doing a paranoid reading. I'm not saying that the way that this film was constructed is for us to empathize with this character or even really understand her, because they give her a vague kind of personality disorder. She's bipolar, schizophrenic, borderline personality, dissociative identity disorder, all mashed together, and it's kept vague enough so that it's like a plug and play. If you want the fact that she's a bit gay to be the reason that she's nuts, then it's that. If you want the fact that she has a mental illness, that she does all the behaviour that she does, then it's that. And it's this kind of unwillingness to deal with the story that it sets up that makes it weak, really. And the shame about that is that Rebecca is the most interesting part of the movie because everything else is dull as shit. And I think it is kind of refreshing to have Rebecca be this weird. Like, personally, I identify more with Rebecca than I do Sarah, because Sarah is not an interesting person and she spends most of her time cloying for this terrible boyfriend that she has, and we are meant to root for this, and then it will cut to a scene of Rebecca writhing in pain because she's not being paid attention to. Those scenes are always just more interesting than whatever is going on with the main character. Back to my point, there's certain behaviors that she exhibits throughout the movie that are meant to encourage us to think of her as strange, and I will get to why that doesn't quite work for me watching. So there's stuff like she's a college student who doesn't want to go clubbing with her friends. She wears Sarah's necklace without asking. She forces an earring through her ears despite not having them pierced. She hits herself in the face and cuts her stomach to make it seem like she was mugged. She draws women that she is obsessed with. She goes to get a tattoo out of nowhere despite saying that she doesn't like them. She gets Sarah's sister's name tattooed on her tit, and she dyes her hair to look like Sarah and has sex with her ex-boyfriend, which is a scene ripped directly out of Single White Female. Obviously, if I was a worse podcast, I would turn to you and be like, these behaviours are wrong, and therefore we shouldn't romanticize obsessive behavior because it's wrong to do these things, and friends should have good boundaries and not do weird shit like that. Now, I I like to think that I have complex opinions about movies, but sometimes my opinion is this feels like a concentrated representation of liking a person more than they like you. The reason why that analysis that I just did was bad is because it tries to look at movies as simply a representation of our reality that has to imbue the audience with a certain kind of morality on how to behave. Whereas, for me, especially when it comes to like queer media about lesbian women who are obsessed with each other or not, a one-sided obsession, is that movies are more interesting when they are simply in an unfiltered representation of an emotional state. And these behaviours, whilst yes, they are violent and unhealthy and toxic and whatever, they also feel like a character who does not know how to socialize and is trying to brute force a friendship because she doesn't know how to make someone like her. So, as a result, she finds a person who she believes is like cool and interesting and tries to be as much like them as possible in the hopes that people will like her the way that people like Sarah. And it doesn't work, because of course it doesn't, because that's the point of the movie. But it is an interesting look at how a lot of us just don't know what the hell we're doing, and in our attempts to be like normal human beings, we end up being really, really weird because we don't know what being ourselves actually is. And I think if we're looking at it as like a split between these two characters, like one's Dr. Jekyll and the other's Mr. Hyde, Rebecca represents this kind of cloying and pathetic version of ourselves who is trying to do all the right things, but in this desperation is pushing people away and making people uncomfortable. And it's this exact behavior that makes people not want to be around you, even though you're trying very hard to make people want to be around you. The line where I stop enjoying this movie is where I feel like the filmmakers are trying to make me identify more with the normal one than the one who is strange, when I think, for me, and to a certain extent, I think a lot of people, someone who is normal is maybe the least relatable person in the world, right? Because we're probably more strange than we are like conforming to specific standards of being alive. And especially if you are someone who is a bit gay and has always felt a bit strange in the world, then how are you ever going to relate to Sarah, who for all intents and purposes is a blank slate of a person who is only made interesting by Rebecca? It's this kind of representation of strangeness that does sour the enjoyment of the movie, because it's specifically reveling in this behavior, but also does not desire to give this behavior any kind of humanity. And I think it's this kind of sectioning off of our strangeness in an attempt to reify heterosexuality at the end of the day. When I come away from this movie, it's like, oh, because being straight is good, yeah? That's what we all believe when we came away from this. So Sarah Todd wrote a really interesting article called Doppelgangers and Depictions of Disorders in The Roommate. The Roommate views mental illness as untreatable and people who live with it as beyond help. At the same time, the film doesn't really believe that Rebecca has any specific disorders. It merely wants to signal that she's out of control and crazy, and thus can be rooted against with impunity. And this is what I was kind of talking about before, it being like a weaker version of more interesting movies, where this kind of narrative is most suited for a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of story, where is one identity split into two people, and you draw the parallels between them, and you deduce that one of these people is attempting to live a normal, repressed life, where they don't do anything bad and they act in a good way that makes them respectable. And this other person takes all of the repression, all of the anger, and all of the parts of this other person that are demeaned and villainized in polite society, concentrates them and acts out various behaviors that causes like disgust and fear in the original person at the idea that this kind of person could exist, but also that these traits could exist in any of us. Now, the problem with this is that these strange behaviors so rarely mimic the original character, which has a lot to do with the fact that she's very underwritten, but also that there are several moments throughout the movie that are meant to clue the audience in to how creepy Rebecca is, but that Sarah doesn't get to see. So I spoke earlier about the petrol station scene where a man comes up to Rebecca and is kind of creepy and won't leave her alone. So she douses him in petrol from the petrol pump and then threatens to light him on fire. Excellent scene. Absolutely fantastic. One of the best scenes in the movie. But she's completely alone when she does this. Like, nobody sees her do this. There isn't a secret reveal where Sarah witnessed this and is like horrified by this behavior. It's simply for the audience to see, because it is not a story even really about Sarah. It is simply about the audience seeing this behavior, realizing who Rebecca is, someone who is socially inept, someone who's a bit emotionally volatile, someone who is a bit gay, and then realizing that she is also violent, and then taking all of those previous behaviors and enshrining them all together, putting them all together as one, taking this character and turning her into someone that we can fear and dislike, with none of the kind of interesting subtext. It is simply for the audience, because we are the ones who are meant to know stuff. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that this isn't a very well written movie. Not well structured at all. Whilst, again, there are lots of fun moments, they are also very derivative moments that exist less to give this movie depth, if we can say that, but more to signal to the audience the genre of the movie. This, like I said earlier, is a rip-off of Single White Female. So you're meant to watch this and be like, oh, this is like Single White Female. I know what kind of movie I'm watching, so I don't really have to pay attention that hard. I can just kind of coast through it, which is really a terrible thing to do to the audience. You know, you want to keep them engaged, and I guess the only way they manage to do that is with intermittent violence for adolescents. The only moment that Sarah actually witnesses of Rebecca when she's not aware of it is when she's gone back to Rebecca's house for Thanksgiving, and she sees Rebecca and her father in the kitchen talking in the middle of the night. And this kind of visit is mostly just to clue Sarah in, because she's been completely fucking oblivious up to this point, that Rebecca has the potential to be dangerous, and it's not actually any of the behaviour that she's exhibited thus far. It's mostly that she takes medication and might have a personality disorder. Once again, because Sarah has failed to witness or really pay attention to Rebecca at all, we have to know that Rebecca is bad not because of her behaviours, but because she has some kind of mental illness, and it's vague enough that they can, deny being offensive to a specific type of person, but it also does allow them to be like really malleable with it, so they can just attribute any kind of behavior to any kind of mental illness, because mental illness in these kinds of movies is not meant to be as Sarah Todd was saying, a treatable thing. Is simply meant to be crazy, and then the behaviors that are associated with crazy. Now, I say all this fully with the knowledge that when I watched this movie, especially the second time that I watched it, I was rooting for Rebecca. I just was, because, and this might be a hot take, I don't know, this movie hasn't been spoken about for a very long time, and I doubt people have thought about it in a really long time, but has anyone considered that maybe Sarah is the bad roommate? Has anyone considered this? There are several behaviours that we could attribute to this. The first and most glaring being that she just brings home a kitten without asking. I've lived with people who have just very suddenly brought home animals without asking me. It's not a good feeling, because you're like, oh, okay, we're not getting the deposit back ever, are we? Because this animal's gonna like shit on the floor or scratch stuff up. And we're just gonna have to try and clean it up and hope no one notices, and they will, you know. You lose your deposit, that's just how that goes. And it's not just that she brings home a kitten. She's just like, oh, we got a kitten we can look after. It's that she brings home a kitten and then leaves it with Rebecca all the time. She doesn't look after the cat. We don't see her looking after it. And then literally, she never looks after the cat and is only upset about it once she realizes that the kitten has gone missing. Now, of course, Rebecca should not have put the cat in the washing machine. And yes, this is the scene that I was talking about earlier that stuck in my brain, because it's a memorable scene. You know, you see someone put a kitten in a washing machine and you're like, oh no. But also, there is some kind of twisted catharsis there, because if you are someone who has been identifying with Rebecca and you're someone who is annoyed at the way that certain roommates will take advantage of your good nature and politeness and willingness to do whatever to make sure someone will be friends with you, it runs out eventually, and this manifests in various ways. And I think the anger behind the animal cruelty, to me, feels more human than kind of anything Sarah does in the movie. Like I said, she's meant to be the normal one, and she has like zero personality traits. She's meant to be like a blank slate to identify with to the crazy counterpart that she's living with. But because Rebecca is quote unquote crazy, she's more dynamic. She has more interesting qualities to her. When she does stuff like pretend to be Sarah on the phone speaking to Sarah's ex, when she does stuff like getting a tattoo of Sarah's sister's name, it gives her kind of depth, whether intentional or otherwise, that Sarah just simply does not have. The reading that it is Sarah that is actually the bad roommate is far more interesting to me, specifically because I just don't identify with Sarah, and a lot of the meaner and more pathetic aspects of Rebecca are way more identifiable for someone like me, who is also a weird queer freak who is not emotionally stable all the time and has moments of jealousy and anger. I think the catharsis of this character is something that is far more interesting than someone who goes to college and tries to study fashion and gets a boring boyfriend that she meets at a party and has like disdain for a slightly weird and uptight roommate. It's not something that I personally identify with. I feel like if you do identify more with Sarah, then you probably had an easy time in high school, and that's not your fault, but it does make you boring. As I was saying, just really deeply pathetic part of everyone, I think, even the people who were popular in high school, where you were trying very, very hard to be normal and be likable, and everything that you're doing is pushing people away from you, and every interaction with other people feels like a confirmation of the fear that people are only hanging around you because they feel obligated to, and not because they actually like you. For me, the interesting part of this movie is the assertion that there are certain people who simply cannot live a normal life, and that this world that these characters live in do not accept people like Rebecca, and that there is no place for her at all, and how deeply sad that is, especially because Rebecca tries so hard to live a life that she can't ever have because she is too strange. And I think the movie tries to soften the blow of its more homophobic aspects by having a gay character in it. Irene, who is Sarah's friend, it's not really explained how they know each other, but they both want to work in fashion. And, you know, Irene is explicitly gay, and I think this is meant to like soften the homophobia of Rebecca's character, but it mostly just serves to draw a line between who can be assimilated and who has to be tossed into the shadows and ultimately destroyed in order for normal society to function. And I gotta be honest, I'm not really interested in the affirmation of normality as someone who really can't be normal, as someone who really struggles to be normal and is mostly given up on trying to be. Assimilation for a lot of people is not possible. And I think that's why it's such a contentious subject, because there are some people who are always going to be queer, as in strange, along with their sexuality. Some people are always going to be considered strange, and if we're constantly trying to align ourselves with heteronormativity, then what happens to the freaks and weirdos of the world? Like, where do they go?
What are you doing? Sit down and shut up. Listen to me. All I ever wanted was to be a friend. Rebecca, I am your friend. No, you're not. Yes, I am. No, you're not. We're here because you betrayed me. Rebecca, I'm your friend. Stop! Stop saying things you don't mean! I protected you. I protected you against that whore Tracy and that nasty little kitten, that scumbag of a professor. Even that loser ex-boyfriend of yours. What did you do to him? I got rid of them all for you! And how do you repay me by leaving me? Rebecca, please forgive me, okay? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. From the bottom of my heart. Please forgive me. I forgive you. Okay. Now we can start all over again. Just like that first day. Just the two of us together. Because I only want you to have one best friend.
It would be hard to talk about this movie without talking about obsession. It's a theme that turns up a lot in toxic lesbian movies. And having watched a few of them in preparation for doing this podcast, I kind of came up with like a thesis that is necessary for these kinds of movies to work. So obsession typically manifests itself in a stalker when someone desires traits or experiences that have been unobtainable to them due to social ineptitude or physical insecurity, simply just being a bit strange. And in the person being stalked, this translates to wanting to distance yourself from the more troubling traits of your personality. So I talked about in the previous section how these films kind of function as a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where you get to sever yourself off from anything that might taboo or upsetting or a bit queer about you, and you get to be a nice, normal, heterosexual person. And how putting all of that onto one person allows you to be a functional member of society. I'm going to reference that Sarah Todd article that I spoke about a bit earlier once again, because Todd has a lot of interesting insight on this film, and she's one of the only people that did seem to do an actual analysis of it. So this article says, Rebecca seems to choose women who look like her because they are alternate versions of her, the self she wishes she could be. Happier, lighter, more popular, more successful. And it's interesting to think about the doppelganger aspect from Sarah's perspective too. What do you do when your darker self, the person who's unstable and needy and depressed and melodramatic, the person you try to suppress, refuses to leave you alone? Stalking in movies is depicted in different ways. With these kinds of movies, as I've discussed, it is a lot of taking on traits of the person that you want to be like and also, wanting to be around them all the time and getting mad when they don't want to be around you. What is interesting is that a lot of this behavior, at least early on in the film, is depicted as simply Rebecca trying very hard to be a good friend and taking an interest in her roommate. So you have stuff like, once she finds out that Sarah's favourite movie is The Devil Wears Prada, she puts a poster up in her room. I did speak earlier about how these kinds of movies tend to pathologize certain behaviors and make them seem more sinister than maybe they are. So stuff like putting a poster up because you want to be closer to your friend is pretty like innocuous early friendship behavior, and kind of common in having a roommate. You decorate together, find shared interests, and try to live around one another. But because this film is intent on portraying these behaviors as like sinister, this kind of behavior is meant to more like breadcrumb how much that we're meant to distrust this character, and serves to more foreground how fucked up and evil she's going to end up being. There's also like the interesting aspect of stalking, or like sinister or abject behavior that women display, is often rooted in envy. This kind of idea that women can't ever really be friends with one another or be in relationships with one another because they're too similar and they're constantly competing for the attention of men. At the same time, I think it's interesting that there are certain women who, and I mean this in like the least incel way, are kind of cut off from a level of intimacy that they maybe desire. So I think the most interesting scene to evidence this is when Rebecca takes Sarah's ex-boyfriend's phone call and proceeds to have phone sex with him, and how this scene is specifically intercut with Sarah and her new boyfriend Stephen having sex as well. So you have one character who is able to successfully obtain heterosexuality, and this other character who can only have this simulated version that is like abstracted through a phone call, and even then it is not her boyfriend, it is her roommate's boyfriend who she's attempting to be more like, in the hopes that she can eventually be a good normal heterosexual. And it's something that the film looks down on her for. Even though there is a big push for heterosexuality in the movie, all of this behavior is presented as sinister and fucked up, and the sexual element of it is kind of presented as the most fucked up. Later in the film, Rebecca goes to have sex with Jason in real life and then ends up murdering him. This is the most obvious image of like the perversion of heterosexuality. It's not something that is obtainable to her. So because this heterosexuality is filtered through abject terms such as a stalking situation, it's not something that can ever be successful or obtained for her, because in a lot of respects the stalker is not so much a person as it is our fear of the worst parts of ourselves making the worst choices, and it's all like concentrated onto one character. So another trope of these movies is that there is always another person who has been the victim of stalking and obsession, and even murder in some cases, that the main character stumbles upon the more they get to know this other person. It's a really brief scene. Like a lot of scenes in this movie, it mostly exists to make Rebecca seem evil and weird. So we see Maria, when Sarah and Rebecca go home for Thanksgiving, they like wander around the town. It's not a very long or fleshed out scene, but they go into this cafe and they see Maria, who is Rebecca's previous victim. She kind of out of nowhere says, "We were never friends," and this is meant to be a slight against Rebecca and evidence for Sarah that there is something wrong with Rebecca and people don't enjoy being around her, and therefore she should be isolated and we should cut her off and not speak to her or ask her about her life. This is a good movie with good messages. In a good movie, this kind of nefarious past, it shows this behavior as like a pattern It shows like what happens when an abusive person has not been like dealt with, which is a harsh word, but it's when someone has been allowed to get away with certain behaviours with no intervention by doctors or the police. Like I said, this film doesn't have like a specific illness that Rebecca has. She's just strange and evil. That's the whole thing. I think there would be like a different vibe to it if like she was possessed by a demon. Like it wouldn't have a specific mental illness mapped onto it, but because it's so vague, it allows the audience to kind of conjure up their own prejudices. When it comes to like lesbian obsession and the idea that a gay woman, a lesbian woman, experiencing attraction or affection for a straight woman is like the most upsetting thing to ever exist, is obviously rooted in homophobia. But to be annoying and a contrarian, I also think that the language for romantic and sexual relationships between women, there isn't as much of a social script for it, at least in like the mainstream. So I think for a lot of queer women, it mostly comes down to either repressing it completely, not dealing with it at all, and just like convincing yourself that you're straight or that you don't experience sexual attraction, or going right the other way and having it take over your life and having like zero regulation, not being able to like control yourself. I think for a lot of queer women is kind of a fantasy, just being able to be as messy and mean and domineering as possible, because there are so few avenues where that is socially acceptable. And in movies, there are endless supplies of evil, promiscuous women, and the predatory lesbian itself can kind of, if we are to reclaim it, and I'm not saying you have to, it can be an interesting, I guess, expression of the unfiltered, unfettered, unheterosexualized desire of women that is just too much for normal society to handle. And to what extent do you even want normal society to handle your sexuality? I think for most of history, the most meager expressions of non-heterosexual sexualities have been seen as deviant. So why not be the most deviant? Why not be the most like emotionally unstable, sexually provocative, domineering woman in the world, be obsessive and just freak everyone out? And how that as like a microcosm can be an expression of years of repressed desire that just hasn't had anywhere to go. There's a really good article written by Bryony White called Return of the Lesbian Psycho, Why Killer Queens Stalk Pop Culture, which basically expresses that these characters experience excesses of rage and violence because of the homophobic society in which they live, pushed to murderous ends by shame and hostility. Murder, it seems, like queerness, has become a way to escape the tyranny of the liberal bourgeois boredom of family life.
I'm feeling a little dizzy.
Let's find you a seat and I'll grab you a towel. I'm gonna grab a beer. Do you want one?
Oh no, thanks. I'm just having punch.
That might explain a few things. We tend to spike the punch.
You spike it.
Yeah.
Nice.
When a girl has had 3 cups, 4, if we don't get her up into our room, we have to pull kitchen duty for like a week.
The thing about me is that I will very easily enjoy a film about a woman who is evil and a lesbian, and I will mostly be not offended by that. And I think going into this movie, having watched it before but not really remembered it that well because I watched it for the first time as a teenager, I was expecting it to be quote unquote offensive. Like, I can deal with that, that's fine. I think the biggest flaw of this movie is that it is obsessed with heterosexuality. And when you go into it and you're being promised like a story about predatory lesbians and you barely get any of that because we have to keep cutting to Sarah and her annoying, terrible boyfriend, it does leave this film just feeling very uneven. Of course, you want more scenes of Rebecca being weird and evil, but you don't get that. and I think it is a problem, not just because these scenes are boring. They exist in contrast to the queerness of the movie, to be like the good and right way for Sarah to be behaving. And this is all like topped off by Sarah really enjoying being around her terrible boyfriend. And like what you'll like notice in the horror of the late 2000s and early 2010s is this reversion to specific prejudices, which I did speak about earlier before. Misogyny in horror has always been a controversial topic, hasn't it? Specifically discussing why post 9/11 misogyny, also homophobia, was as rampant in movies and TV as it was. I think sometimes you think you're gonna go back and watch a film pre-2000s and it's gonna be like regressive and you're not gonna be able to identify with it. And then you'll watch certain movies and be like, oh my god, I didn't even think that people in the 60s and 70s would think like this. It's very important, and I'm learning this more and more, that time does move in cycles and is greatly affected by world events. And unfortunately, 9/11 affected a lot of the world, but particularly America. I am going to just like give a brief history lesson, which I feel like I haven't done in a while, but I am going to. I found this interesting article written by Adam Saraswati Rawlings titled Why the 2000s Was a Misogynistic Wasteland, and this article says this. By the end of the 90s, a whole generation had grown up with the notion that women work, earn their own money, and subvert the 1950s model as a social norm. This led to an attitude at the change of the millennium that women had it all, they could work, live independently, and lead their own lives. In turn, this gave rise to the idea of post-feminism. The ideal of the independent city girl who follows strict feminine gender norms and ultimately aims to win a man's heart became the face of aspirational female characters in the media. These characters all followed a similar streak. They were white, feminine, and centered their story arc on the dependence of male gratification. This culture arguably began with the public lampooning of Monica Lewinsky in the late 90s and continued through the new decade with the mistreatment of Britney Spears, Amanda Bynes, Lindsay Lohan, Paris Hilton, Janet Jackson, and Anna Nicole Smith, to name only a handful of women who were punished by the media. Belittling women who lived in the public eye was not only normal, but it was a lucrative business. There was also a really good book by Glen Donnar titled Troubling Masculinities, Terror, Gender, and Monstrous Others in American Film Post 9/11, which says this. American national identity, notions of manhood, and expressions of hegemonic masculinity are often linked, especially in periods of perceived crisis. The 9/11 attacks were persistently figured in gendered terms, and the political, military, and cultural responses equally so, diagnosing perceived gender deficiencies, valorizing particular heroic and professional masculinities, and promoting the return to traditional masculinity and strong father figures. The attacks presented a supposed opportunity to recuperate traditional gender roles to redress America's international position. So there was just like a big affirmation of specific gender anxieties in movies, and the misogyny of 2000s horror is kind of especially gnarly. Once again, you'd think that the older the film is, the more misogynistic it would be, but that's not always the case. Like I said, it goes in cycles, and I think whenever we go through a big cultural shift, it is reflected in how men and women are depicted on screen, and I think this film is kind of configured in specific gendered terms, but it has this kind of weird self-awareness and smugness about it. A similar movie that comes to mind is the film Sorority Row, which is itself a remake of an 80s movie. And that movie configures misogyny and puts it into the mouths of these college girls. They are the ones leading the story. They are also very misogynistic towards other women. They are very cruel to one another. It does have this sense of humor about it, as if the idea that they're both employing misogyny and also are aware of misogyny. It's this kind of smug nihilism, I think post South Park, very much seeping into everything, where if you sincerely care about something, if you are like me pointing out the identity politics of various movies, then you are missing the point and you care too much and you're not cool. I've never claimed to be cool, and me recognizing that Stephen is the fucking worst and has the most red flags of any man I've ever seen, and yet Sarah is boring enough to be attracted to his kind of blasé attitude towards potential sexual assault, it of course just smacks of all of the misogyny has just been recuperated, and it's okay for us to make jokes about it now. And we aren't actually going to subvert anything. We're just going to remake movies that have already existed, but we're self-aware enough to know that if we elbow the audience about how the misogyny functions in the movie, then that's enough. We don't actually have to do anything else. We can just kill the weird woman and have the straight relationship be safe in the end. College as a horror setting is an interesting one because college has been something that women have attended for quite a while. Obviously, there is a class difference between those who can and can't afford to go to college. Historically, I suppose in like American culture, college has been the place where women look for husbands, and it's the college courses that women sit are frivolous and they only exist to kind of waste time until they find a man to marry, and then they can drop out and do the whole homemaking thing. When you put college in a horror setting, whether it intends to or not, it turns the movie into a film about what exists in this setting to harm the women who go there, what exists in this setting to prevent them from finding a husband. Now, obviously, this isn't like 1950s and the film is aware of this. It's not treating these women as like chaste or uncultured. They are still like technically modern young women. The heterosexuality of it all still stands. That part hasn't really changed. So whilst Sarah can flirt with her teacher a bit and Tracy can get drunk and go off with a man in the middle of the club, there is still this affirmation that finding a monogamous relationship to fill up all of your time is the end goal and will ultimately keep women the most safe. Historically untrue, factually inaccurate, however, affirmed by this movie. For me, if I were to genuinely point out the parts of this movie that scared me, it wasn't Rebecca. It wasn't the cat in the washing machine. It wasn't that man being covered in petrol. It wasn't the stalking or the obsession or the erratic behaviour. It was this early frat house scene where young women are being plied with alcohol, getting so drunk that the potential of sexual violence is not only mentioned but actively joked about, and our main character just laughs along. And because this character doesn't have any depth to her, there is no implication that she's doing this out of politeness or she's doing this because she doesn't want to seem uncool. She seems to just genuinely be charmed by Stephen. Terrible Stephen, who we hate. So the sexual violence becomes either obscured or turned into a joke. Tracy stripping on the stairs, being like filmed in this position, isn't presented as a horrifying, deeply chilling image in this mostly forgettable movie. It is presented as something that is funny and something that prevents Sarah from getting to know Stephen more because she has to rescue her friend, and that's such a burden. A list of other reasons why we hate Stephen. Stephen purposefully spills beer on Sarah so that he can start a conversation. He's not only a dick, he's a pickup artist, which is cool. He espouses that he's going to be yelled at for stopping Tracy from stripping on the stairs and helping them get home safely. Horrible man. We hate him. It's this really horrible quote that he says where he says that what they're challenged to do is to make sure that after a girl has been given 3 drinks, that they herd her to one of the rooms and sexually assault her, because this is 2011 and those conversations apparently do not exist yet. Stephen isn't the villain here, and this is presented as like a cute, funny anecdote that Sarah is charmed by, which, within the context of the movie seems believable because she seems kind of oblivious to Rebecca's behaviour as well. I actually wrote in my script, no wonder you were nearly murdered. Sarah, he's the biggest fucking red flag in the world. This would be one thing. You know, I'm disgusted by it, but I could handle it. There are like two quite serious threats of sexual assault. So there's this first one, and also the instance with her teacher where he kisses her without asking and, you know, offers to take her to Fashion Week, with the implication being as long as she has sex with him. College itself exists to introduce new threats to sheltered people. It's meant to be like a liberating, but also in a horror movie, quite terrifying prospect that you no longer have the safety net of your hometown or your parents, that you're on your own and you have to make your own decisions. And this further threat of this seemingly talented fashion tutor preying on young students, especially the first years, it's another example of like sexual assault on college campus being put below Rebecca, who is presented as more villainous for trying to fake a sexual assault encounter and recording it with the intent of getting this teacher fired specifically for what he did to Sarah. It's this twofold thing, right? Because on the one hand, as we've established, Rebecca exists as Sarah's mirror, as her shadow. So her jumping in to defend Sarah and turning this supposedly innocent teacher into a legitimate creep by pinning legitimate sexual assault on him is merely an extension of the kind of punishment Sarah wished she could enact on him. On the other hand, once again, Rebecca is presented as more threatening to Sarah and to the men around her than heterosexuality and sexual assault itself. Because if someone would fake that, then surely they are more evil than anyone actually purporting to do it. Which, from what is implied, both Stephen and the tutor have a habit of this kind of behaviour, and yet it's not the kind of behaviour that's actively punished by Sarah. She's not someone who really views this as any more fucked up than, you know, Rebecca and the kitten and the washing machine. Within context, it's still the queerness that is the weird, sinister part of the movie. And I found this article by Daisy Jones titled "Pop Culture's Crazy Lesbian Stereotypes Are Harming Queer Women," where it says that these kinds of depictions paint the queer woman as the other, as an entity to avoid and escape like a haunted house, in favour of a safer, more family-oriented home. If straight relationships symbolise security and comfort in pop culture, queer relationships symbolise the antithesis: chaos, deviancy, occasionally even murder. And none of this is more evidenced by the end of the movie, where Rebecca has to die and Sarah must be saved by Stephen, because I can't have any fun. Like, why couldn't Stephen die? Why couldn't Stephen die? That would be, I would add points back on. I would seek to defend this movie more if Stephen had died, but he doesn't. He's the one that saves Sarah, and heterosexuality is restored, and this film, whether on purpose or not, manages to be incredibly homophobic once again. And it's not uninteresting. I had a lot to say here, but it's just really, really disappointing, because how can I possibly revel in it when this movie dedicates so much of its time to its boring straightness? And more scenes should be Rebecca being a freak, because that's what we came here to see. Does this film look like a badger? Yes. I am someone who's very much in favour of gay people acting poorly. And I think that this movie could have done such a better job simply by being stranger, by being more fucked up, and, you know, having a different ending where maybe the straight people die this time. I don't know. Basically, this film feels like you're watching a worse version of a better movie. It's like a Lifetime Hallmark equivalent of a better movie. Every scene where Rebecca isn't on screen, the movie's really dull. This film dedicated so much time to its boring straight relationship because it's a film that is invested in its misogyny and heteronormativity. If the movie was more fun, this film could probably be reclaimed further down the line, but it is hampered by its age rating. It's simply not bloody enough, not gory enough, and not fucked up enough. There's so little actual on-screen violence. The film also seeks to code a lot of normal friendship behaviour as odd, and ultimately puts the blame for the antics in the film on some vague personality disorder. The audience is left to fill in the gaps and ultimately view any kind of queerness as insanity. Incredibly regressive, as many horror movies around this time period were, because it is like replicating the more sinister parts of older movies without really updating them to reflect on the misogyny and homophobia that was present in them. I'm going to give some recommendations, and you know what? Just to prove a point, they're going to be problematic as well. They're going to be about gay obsession, because this is my podcast and these are the kinds of movies that I like. And now you might be wondering, this is a movie that is essentially a remake of Single White Female. Should you go back and watch Single White Female? Yes. Yes, you should. Because it has two really good lead performances. It has a massive apartment that you can't believe two people can afford the rent for. And it is just the blueprint for these kinds of stories. It's just as homophobic, you know? It's just as much homophobic as it is here. But the story is just, it's more compelling. There is also animal cruelty in it, if that's why you came here, you know? If that's what you wanted to see, then it's there. But yeah, it's essentially the same story. It's about a woman who needs to find a roommate after the breakdown of her relationship, and how this roommate is not quite all there. She's a bit mad, and she's a bit gay, and she's a bit wanting to be exactly like you. But that's okay, because it's flattering. Okay. The next movie that I'm going to recommend is a fairly recent movie. Came out around a similar time as this one. It's a movie called Cracks, and it stars Eva Green. Now that already should be a selling point for you. Have you seen Eva Green? You should. She's beautiful. It's set in a British school in the 30s where the arrival of a new student causes fractures, or cracks, amongst the students and faculty. And that's as much as I'm going to say, because this movie gets really fucked up, especially towards the end. But it does have that kind of like teenage obsession, all like concentrated into a boarding school where you can't really escape each other. It feels underrated actually, because I haven't seen that many people talk about it, but it's really good. Like when I finished it, I was actually like, oh my god, can't believe it that it ended like that. Now this last one is not for the faint of heart. I'm not joking when I say this is probably one of the most disturbing movies that I've ever sat through. I think I was transfixed the entire time I was watching it, but it is very unnerving, and I think specifically because of its homophobia, but also because of its quite graphic sexual violence and how that kind of plays into the movie. And that's a movie called Windows. Like I said, it's very genuinely violently homophobic. Very interesting. It has Talia Shire in it. After a woman is assaulted in her flat, she ends up forming a relationship with the police officer overseeing her case, much to the anger of her lesbian neighbour who is obsessed with her. Now, like I said, it gets really, really fucked up, especially in the beginning, so do mind yourself when you're going into this one. And also, like I said, it is homophobic. However, I found it had a lot to also say about homophobia and what it does to people, how shame and repression manifests itself in really fucked up ways, and I found it genuinely transfixing to watch. So I do recommend it, even though you're going to have a bad time watching it. So like I said, not for the faint of heart. Proceed with caution. And with that, I want to thank you for listening. I will be back shortly with more bonus episodes covering new releases, as well as my regularly scheduled deep dive in August. If you'd like to stay updated, please make sure to follow me on Twitter at LikeABadgerPod. Follow me on Spotify, YouTube and TikTok for full episodes and teasers. If you'd like to read some of my writing, you can visit ambergunwalk.com. I recently wrote about adolescence, if you'd like to read that. I also published a new poem called Rat Bastard. You can read that as well. I'm hoping to have a new piece about internet horror coming out at the end of June / the beginning of July. Hopefully it'll be out soon. I will link it somewhere once it is. Everything that I have cited is going to be in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next time. Bye!